In a small, quiet neighborhood, an unexpected disaster struck as a powerful storm unleashed relentless rain, threatening to flood the entire community. With emergency services overwhelmed and the floodwaters rising, it seemed like there was no hope left. But in the midst of chaos, an elderly man named George Matthews stepped forward. Known for his quiet nature and sharp mind, George put his ingenuity to work, using old construction techniques to redirect the floodwaters away from his neighbors' homes. What began as a desperate attempt to save his own house quickly turned into a heroic effort to save the entire neighborhood. George's quick thinking and resourcefulness would soon make him a local legend. In the small, tight-knit neighborhood of Elmwood, nestled between rolling hills and quiet streets, no one could have predicted the extraordinary events that would unfold one fateful summer. Elmwood was a peaceful community where everyone knew each other's name and neighbors looked out for one another. Among the residents was George Matthews, a 78-year-old man known for his quiet demeanor and unmatched ingenuity. George had lived in Elmwood for over 50 years, watching it grow from a humble collection of houses into a charming suburban area. He had worked as a carpenter for much of his life, building furniture, repairing homes, and always finding creative solutions to problems. However, it was not his carpentry skills that George would become known for in the coming days. Rather, it would be his quick thinking and resourcefulness that would save Elmwood from a disaster no one had foreseen. The story began on a warm summer afternoon, when the skies began to darken with ominous clouds. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and soon enough, the first drops of rain began to fall. But what seemed like a passing storm quickly turned into a torrential downpour that wouldn't stop. The rain came down in sheets, flooding the streets, overflowing gutters, and turning the normally quiet neighborhood into a scene of chaos. For hours, the rain continued to pour, and the situation worsened. Streets were submerged underwater, and the floodwaters began to creep closer to the homes. Families rushed to move their belongings to higher ground, and emergency services were overwhelmed with calls for help. In the heart of Elmwood, the Matthews family home stood as an island amidst rising water, and George, sitting on his porch, watched with growing concern. He had lived through storms before, but never one like this. He knew the old drainage system in Elmwood was poorly equipped to handle such heavy rainfall, and if something wasn't done soon, the entire neighborhood would be at risk of severe flooding. As the rain continued to fall, George's mind raced. He knew the streets could only handle so much water before the drainage system would completely fail. And with no one expecting this kind of storm, the city wasn't prepared. George realized that the responsibility of protecting his neighbors might fall on him. Despite his age, George's mind was as sharp as ever, and he quickly recalled a few old techniques he had learned during his younger years, when he worked on various construction sites and had seen his fair share of flooding. With a sense of urgency, George sprang into action. He ran into his garage, pulling out an assortment of tools, pipes, and wooden planks. His neighbors had already started to panic, but George remained calm, his mind calculating the best course of action. He first ran to the nearby culvert, a large drainage pipe that, for years, had been poorly maintained. It was clogged with debris, and the heavy rain had exacerbated the situation. George knew if he didn't clear the blockage, the floodwaters would continue to rise. As he knelt beside the culvert, George worked swiftly, using a crowbar and shovel to clear the debris. His years of experience, working with his hands, paid off, and within a short time, the water began to flow more freely. But George knew this was only a temporary fix. The storm wasn't slowing down, and more water was sure to come. He needed a more permanent solution, and fast. George took a deep breath and turned to his next plan. He remembered an old technique used by farmers in flood-prone areas, creating temporary barriers to redirect the flow of water. With the rain still coming down in torrents, he gathered as many wooden planks and sandbags as he could find from around the neighborhood. He then began to build makeshift barriers, directing the floodwaters away from homes and into the larger drainage areas. It was hard work, but George's determination kept him going. As he worked, his neighbors began to take notice. At first, they were too overwhelmed by the rising waters to do much, but seeing George's determination and resourcefulness, they began to rally. Some helped him carry sandbags, while others worked to clear more debris from the clogged gutters. Together, they formed a human chain, working as quickly as they could to redirect the water before it could reach the homes. George was the steady leader, directing the efforts and offering encouragement as the floodwaters continued to rise. The storm raged on for hours, but George's ingenuity and the collective effort of the neighborhood was slowly beginning to turn the tide. The floodwaters were now moving away from the homes, and though the streets were still submerged, no houses had been flooded. The sound of rushing water could be heard, but it was no longer threatening the community. At one point, a neighbor, Karen, ran over to George, breathless and drenched from the rain. "George, you're a lifesaver," she exclaimed. "If it weren't for you, we would have lost everything." George just smiled, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. "It's not just me, Karen. It's all of us. We're a team. We're saving this neighborhood together." As the hours passed, the storm finally began to subside. The rain slowed to a light drizzle, and the dark clouds slowly began to dissipate. The floodwaters, while still high, were no longer advancing, and George's system of barriers had held strong. The neighborhood had been saved. The emergency services arrived just as the storm began to ease, and they were astonished at what they found. The streets were flooded, but the homes were safe. "Who did all this?" one of the responders asked, looking around in disbelief. "It was George," Karen said proudly, pointing to the elderly man standing in the center of the street, his hands on his hips, surveying the scene. The emergency response team quickly assessed the situation and confirmed that the drainage system had been cleared and the water levels had stabilized. Thanks to George's quick thinking and his ingenious methods, the neighborhood had been spared from widespread flooding. The residents of Elmwood were able to breathe a sigh of relief, but they would never forget the actions of one man who had refused to stand idly by in the face of disaster. In the weeks that followed, George became a local hero. His efforts were recognized by the town council, and they even awarded him a medal for bravery and ingenuity. But for George, the true reward was seeing his neighbors safe and sound, knowing that he had done everything in his power to protect the community he had called home for so many years. The flood had brought out the best in everyone, but it was George's calm, determined leadership that made the difference. In Elmwood, the story of the elderly man who saved the neighborhood from a flood with nothing but his ingenuity would be told for generations to come. And whenever a storm would approach, the people of Elmwood would remember George Matthews, the quiet hero who proved that even in the face of nature's fury, a determined heart and a clever mind could make all the difference.